Hello, I'm Mike Kaiser, and today we're going to talk about standards. This makes sense because that's in my job title, but it should also make sense to you, and let me tell you why. You can see from the title of this session that it's about standards, but it's also about jazz somehow. Well, that's because if you are in the jazz scene, the jazz space, a jazz band, really any kind of jazz-oriented group that you may have been a part of, you realize that they don't always play from set sheet music, right? They get together and they say, we're going to play a song. And if you and I were in the same band and you walked in and you said, we're going to play a song, but it's a song of my own creation and you've never heard it before, that's not going to go super, super well, right? Because it would really help if I knew the melody, the key, something about it. But what usually happens in these jazz environments, a lot of times, people play what are called jazz standards. This means it's a song that everyone kind of knows. Everyone knows the melody. Everyone has played it at least once, if not 1,000 times before. And they can riff off of it. They know what the agreed format is, the agreed melody is, the agreed structure is. And so they can use that to play with it and achieve great things. Think of Take the A Train from Duke Ellington, or really any Sinatra song you may have ever heard. It's been covered quite a bit. That is a jazz standard. In the identity space, there are similar things known as identity standards, and they play a similar role. You know, when you're trying to integrate, trying to make your code work with someone else's code work, it really helps to have an agreed upon way to do that. Now, you could do this a couple ways, right? You could say, okay, look, let me publish my API, you publish your API, we'll figure it out, we'll do a lot of investment and a lot of work between my team and your team, and we'll get things working. And that can happen. But then next week, when you update your side of the equation, or I change my API to accept different parameters or different variables, or different numbers of things, now we've got a problem because all that work we just did has to be redone. We have to reintegrate. And if I'm a user of this software, then I'm going to have to do integration testing and make sure I haven't regressed from what my previous functionality was, which is not great, right? So what identity standards try to do is they try to bring together both practitioners and identity vendors and providers of solutions to use things in a coherent way, basically to code to a third-party standard, much like a jazz standard. And what that means is that as long as I'm compliant with this standard, you can write to it, I can write to it, and when we walk in the same room, ideally, we plug them together, and it just works, or at the very least, we're way ahead of where we would have been otherwise. Now, there's a deck that I'm not going to go through all the slides of because there's a lot of content, a lot of URLs with standards you should know or at least be aware of. I provided links to the standards organization that is backing that standard, some description of its worth, where to find out more information. I'll make these slides publicly available later on, just so you know. But throughout the deck, you'll see this kind of a diagram. Super simplified, probably oversimplified version of an enterprise architecture, right? And so as each standard goes by, what I've done in the slides and the material is identify which components of the environment, of the infrastructure, are playing well together with the standard. Now, and we're thinking about identity standards. There are at least 8, probably more, that are in play. And I've kind of split them into 2 groups. On the left-hand side, you see mature standards. What I mean by that is that these have been around a while or they're heavily adopted. Just to run through them really, really quickly, SCIM is a standard hopefully you all know. It lets people share identity, context, and information between systems. Then you have SAML. SAML does all the single sign-on things that you normally experience, going from one enterprise sphere or one organizational sphere to another via agreed upon trust. OAuth and OpenID does the same thing to a large degree for API connections and programmatic connections. And then the last one is passkeys. Now, I've put this in the mature side of the equation because it's gotten quite a bit of traction, but it's still relatively new. In short, what passkeys do is they attempt to replace passwords, hence the name passkeys versus passwords. And what they typically do is they bind a biometric with a previously established authorization or authentication into a system, hopefully with also being bound to a device. The upshot is that if I know the user's device and I know their authorization, I can tie to a biometric. Those are all a pretty strong combination that I can rely on and let that user store a version of it for presentation later on. Like I said, there's more information later in the deck. You can peel through this later on or find me online if you want more information on the background of any of those. Now, on the other side is emerging. And this is where I do most of my work. And by work, I mean going to standards meetings and talking to people and discussing what's possible, what's not. FastFed lets you hook up both SAML and SCIM connections, ideally from just an email. Verifiable credentials is what I've talked about earlier in a panel session, which is decentralized or digital identity, kind of like putting your identity in a wallet on your mobile device. SCIM Reloaded is basically the next round of SCIM, cursor-based pagination, SCIM events, and some other things I'll talk about possibly later on are involved in that, still emerging. And then shared signals. Shared signals is what we'll really spend our time on in the last 8 or so minutes we have. And that is really coming along. And let me go ahead and go through quickly all of these slides, just so I can get to where I want to be, which is on shared signals. Now, shared signals is with the OpenID Foundation, and what it basically does is it gives you a way to share context about identities in live sessions, right? It's PubSub. We'll talk about the details here in a minute, but basically it just lets you share information in real time. If Kaiser, say me, is a threat to an organization, what I'd really like to do is have everyone know, every component in that infrastructure know that at the very least, my risk level is raised and they might want to take action. Each of these standards I give what is it, why is it useful, and how common is it. It's still emerging, but there was already an interop in February in London that we participated in as part of it, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. You can see the URL at the bottom for the specifications and all that kind of good stuff. In this case, there could be lots and lots of lines on this diagram. Basically, any component in that infrastructure might want to play. And really, one of the impetuses for this standard was the rise of zero trust. Really, what we want to do is, in near real time as possible, share information about an identity, about a person, about how trustworthy they are, what their status is, what their credentials are like. And so we started out building what's called the shared signals framework. There were a lot of people, as you can see, that have been in and out of the working group. And basically what this allows us to do is share information. Think of a SSO vendor versus an IGA vendor versus a VPN versus MFA. All of these groups sharing information in near real time via events rather than hoarding that information, basically making things a team sport. I mentioned it was event-based. Basically, something happens in one of the components in the infrastructure, say single sign-on, that Kaiser's say I log in and then I log in again, not via VPN from Tokyo, which should be physically impossible. Easy example. That SSO vendor should know that now I'm a threat and they should revoke any live sessions I have. And usually, historically, that would be the end of it. But with shared signals, now they can broadcast out an event to anyone else who is listening, and they can take actions as well. So, for example, IGA could receive that this person is more of a threat, evaluate that risk level, and then decide to take action on their own. Note that these events are descriptive, not prescriptive. In other words, no one likes to be told what to do. So basically it says, look, I revoked all this user sessions. You might want to do something, but I'm going to let you choose. The framework is at the bottom. Like I said, it's a pub-sub kind of approach that shares what are called security event tokens, just JOTs to you and me. They have a subject identification. It's done via stream management, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And it's push or pull. They can be pushed immediately, or you can require them to pull for it. Up top, you see the different event types. Starting on the right-hand side is risk. These are more account identity level events, not as widely adopted as the middle category, which is CAPE. And the Interop in London in February focused on these continuous access evaluation profile events. This is intended to deal with live sessions, change in credentials, changes in how much risk the person is perceived with, session management, those sorts of things. Then on the far right are SCIM events, and that's another proposed standard that I'm a co-author with in the IETF, part of that SCIM Reloaded. And this will be doing SCIM via an event-based approach rather than full-on connections. So when you set up a stream, basically the receiver starts a relationship and says, hey, I'm interested in events from you. The transmitter says, great, what events and who are you interested in? The receiver sends that information, chooses push versus pull, and then when events come up, that dedicated stream is used to communicate those events. The subjects or the identities in these events can be simple or they can be complex. It could be as simple as an email identifier. For the Interop, that's all we used was emails. It could be something more complicated with more information. It can also be more than one subject. It doesn't just have to be Kaiser. It could be all of the Yahoos who work for SailPoint who wear a hat, if you happen to have that information. The idea is you can use a class instead of single one-offs. Now, the way this looks like from a SailPoint perspective, and you'll see the members of the Interop on the left-hand side from February, is that they detect something going on with an identity, and they send a session revoked event. At that point, SailPoint would take in that event via some additional code that I wrote that I'll talk about here in a minute, and from that event basis, we would call into Identity Security Cloud and start a workflow. At that point, we can do whatever we kind of want. I borrowed a workflow from my colleagues, and basically it looks up to see, do we know the person, how high a risk are they, and then takes action based off of that. But the point is you're into a workflow based off of this event reception. Transmitting event works similarly. If anyone goes to an inactive state within SailPoint, well, we can send a session revoked event, and then the other side can take actions. A classic example here would be us moving an identity to inactive. And then what we want to do is suspend all accounts, but we also want any live sessions that Duo or Okta or anyone else has to be nuked as well. If we switch to the demo screen real quick, there's nothing really, really fancy here. We see the SailPoint console, and you can see the workflows that I have in SailPoint. But more than that, let's go look at the actual interface for the standard. This is just the API Swagger docs for the standard. And the way it works is you kind of bootstrap your way up. You call the well-known configuration, at which point you get the information on how to connect to the rest of the system. You get the identification of the transmitter issuer. You get their security keys. You get what methods are supported, whether it's push or pull based off of RFC, where to create streams, et cetera, et cetera. Once you have that information, then you can go through and get the keys. You can create streams. You can pull for events, do all of that kind of good stuff. I'll publish this Swagger documentation as well for you. But I want to show you real quick the demo from the Interop. And what you're about to see is you're about to see Helisoft revoke security clearance, and that will send out a security event token to everyone else. And in this case, Duo's listening, and SailPoint is listening for the event. So this is in Helisoft, another participant in the Interop, looking up a user and manually, in this case, is going to revoke the security clearance for this user. You can see it's active, and it's going to flip it to revoke state here. I'm going to save the changes. And as a result, inside Helisoft, they're going to issue a event. And you can see that event here, identifying who it is, what the type is, any information that's relevant. And now we flip to Duo. And Duo is showing you that it's logging in. And I'll kind of fast forward a little bit here. Logging in with the user. can still see it here, I think. And they logged in with the user, and they showed that it was successful. Hold on. Things have gone awry. And now what's happening is that after they logged in, assuming this is still playing, I don't have control of my video anymore. A little bit fragmented. What it's doing is it's running a manual Python script to check for events. It'll poll here in a minute. It's polling for events. And it's going to receive that event from Helisoft in just a second. The event came through, and now it's revoking that previous MFA qualification that it had set up. And you'll see them log back in to this sample app from Duo. Once he refreshes, the user will be required to go back in and re-authenticate and redo the MFA process, as you can see here. Now, at the same time, while this is happening, keep in mind this is broadcast out. So this same event is going to be received on the SailPoint end, and we can take action as well. And you'll see that here in just a moment, once we get past the Duo section. And once we receive the event, what you're going to see on the SailPoint side is just a default logging in to ServiceNow instance, developer instance. And then after that happens, we'll receive the event on the SailPoint side. You'll see the log of that. And then you can already see he's logged into the ServiceNow instance. We logged back out. And then you'll see the event coming in here into to SailPoint, the same event that came from Helisoft. And now we kick off a workflow from that. We received it and kick off a workflow and throw it into the workflow, and then it disables and suspends all the accounts for Lee Owens. And so the point is, the shared signals allows us to play as a team with others in the industry. In other words, if you're an organization, you don't want silos of information, silos of control. What you want is my knowledge shared with your knowledge, and your knowledge shared with my knowledge as components, so that we all work together to reinforce zero trust and to make sure we share knowledge so that each component makes an informed choice about the security decisions made for each individual identity. And this is just an example of what's possible with standards. They're not always useful, but often they are, and they help advance the goal of making identity security a team sport. Thanks for your time. Thanks for listening. If you have questions about standards, you can find me easily online. And now I'm going to cut back to Colin to wrap up day 4.